What if the most powerful nation in the modern world began not as a grand design, but as a fragile gamble, an experiment stitched together by dreamers, debtors, dissenters, and the desperate? Long before skyscrapers pierced the sky of New York and rockets rose from Florida shores, a thin line of settlements clung nervously to the eastern edge of a vast and unknown continent. Their survival was uncertain, their unity was not existent, and yet, from these scattered colonies emerged a force that would reshape global history. The story of the American colonies begins not with certainty, but with risk. In 1607, three small ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, anchored along the banks of a marshy river in what would become Virginia. The settlers named their fragile outpost Jamestown, honoring King James I of England. They came seeking gold and a faster route to Asian riches. What they found instead was hunger, disease, and conflict. Many of the early colonists were gentlemen unused to manual labor. They searched for treasure while food supplies dwindled. By the winter of 1609-1610, remembered as the starving time, hundreds had died. Some accounts suggest cannibalism occurred as desperation reached its peak. Yet, Jamestown did not vanish. It adapted. Tobacco, introduced and cultivated successfully by John Rolfe, transformed the colony's fortunes. European demand for tobacco surged, and Virginia's economy stabilized. But prosperity came with a dark cost. In 1619, the first recorded Africans arrived in Virginia. Over time, chattel slavery hardened into law, embedding itself deeply into the colonial system and laying a moral contradiction at the heart of the future nation. While Virginia struggled for profit, another colony formed for a different reason: faith. In 1620, the Mayflower carried a group of English separatists, later known as the Pilgrims, across the Atlantic. They sought religious freedom, not wealth. Landing far north of their intended destination, they established Plymouth Colony in present-day Massachusetts. Before stepping ashore, they drafted the Mayflower Compact, an agreement to form a self-governing community. It was not democracy as later understood, but it was revolutionary, authority derived from the consent of the governed. Plymouth endured brutal winters and severe shortages. Assistance from local indigenous peoples, including members of the Wampanoag Confederacy, proved critical. For a time, cooperation allowed the colony to survive. Yet underlying tensions remained, and over decades those tensions would explode into violent conflicts such as King Philip's War in the 1670s, one of the deadliest wars per capita in American history. The New England region soon expanded beyond Plymouth. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, founded in 1630 by Puritans led by John Winthrop, aimed to build a city upon a hill, a model Christian society. They valued literacy to ensure Bible reading, establishing schools and eventually Harvard College in 1636. But their vision of religious purity also produced intolerance. Dissenters like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson were banished. Williams would go on to found Rhode Island, pioneering principles of religious liberty and separation of church and state. Further south, Maryland was established in 1634 as a haven for English Catholics under Lord Baltimore. Though envisioned as a refuge, it too grappled with sectarian tension. The Maryland Toleration Act of 1649 attempted to protect Trinitarian Christians, marking an early, imperfect experiment in religious coexistence. Meanwhile, in the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, a different social pattern emerged. Originally settled by the Dutch as New Netherland, New York became English-controlled in 1664. The region was diverse from the start. Dutch merchants, English farmers, German immigrants, Swedish settlers, and enslaved Africans lived side by side. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn in 1681 as a Quaker colony, emphasized tolerance, fair dealings with Native Americans, and representative governance. Philadelphia quickly grew into one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the colonies. By the early 18th century, 13 distinct colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast. They were not united. Each had its own charter, economy, and identity. New England thrived on shipping, fishing, and small farms. The middle colonies exported grain and furs. The southern colonies relied heavily on plantation agriculture. Tobacco, rice, indigo, worked increasingly by enslaved labor. Despite differences, several common threads began to weave them together. First, distance from Britain fostered a culture of self-rule. Colonial assemblies emerged in nearly every colony, controlling taxation and local legislation. Governors appointed by the crown often found themselves negotiating with elected representatives who guarded their authority fiercely. Second, a shared British identity coexisted with growing autonomy. Colonists considered themselves loyal subjects. They celebrated British victories in wars against France and Spain. The French and Indian War, 1754-1763, part of the global 7 Years' War, proved pivotal. Colonial militias fought alongside British troops to expel France from North America. Victory gave Britain vast new territories, but also enormous debt. That debt changed everything.
To raise revenue and tighten control, Parliament imposed new taxes: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the township duties. For the first time, colonists were taxed directly by a parliament in which they had no elected representatives. No taxation without representation became more than a slogan. It was a constitutional argument rooted in English political tradition. Resistance grew. Merchants organized boycotts. The Sons of Liberty intimidated tax collectors. Tensions erupted in 1770 when British soldiers fired into a crowd in Boston, killing 5
colonists in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Propaganda magnified the incident, fueling outrage. In 1773, Parliament granted the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. In protest, colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. Britain responded with the Coercive Acts, closing Boston's port and limiting Massachusetts' self-government. Rather than isolating Massachusetts, the punitive measures united the colonies in sympathy. In 1774, delegates from 12 colonies convened the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. They did not yet seek independence, they demanded rights as Englishmen. But events accelerated beyond reconciliation. On April 19, 1775, shots rang out at Lexington and Concord. The American Revolutionary War had begun. What started as a dispute over taxation transformed into a struggle over sovereignty. In 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson. It proclaimed that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. The Declaration was radical, not only in severing ties with Britain, but in articulating a philosophy of government grounded in natural rights and popular consent. The war lasted 8 grueling years. Colonial forces, led by George Washington, faced the world's most formidable military power. They endured defeats, shortages, and brutal winters, none more severe than at Valley Forge. Yet French support after 1778 shifted the balance. In 1781, British General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris recognized American independence. But independence did not immediately solve the deeper challenge: unity. Under the Articles of Confederation, the new states formed a loose alliance. The national government lacked power to tax or regulate commerce effectively. Economic instability and internal unrest, such as Shays' Rebellion in 1786, revealed structural weaknesses. In 1787, delegates gathered again in Philadelphia, this time to revise the Articles. Instead, they drafted an entirely new constitution. It created a federal system balancing power between national and state governments and divided authority among legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Ratified in 1788, it became the framework for the United States government. The Bill of Rights, added in 1791, guaranteed freedoms of speech, religion, press, assembly, and due process. These protections reflected colonial experiences under British rule and enshrined civil liberties as foundational principles. Yet the contradictions of colonial origins persisted. Slavery remained entrenched, particularly in the South. Indigenous nations continued to face displacement as American expansion accelerated westward. The ideals proclaimed in 1776 would require generations of struggle to approach fulfillment. What makes the colonial story astonishing is not simply that 13 small settlements defeated a global empire. It is that they transformed inherited British political traditions into something new. They experimented with self-governance across diverse regions. They debated rights, sovereignty, and representation in pamphlets, town meetings, and legislative halls. They forged identity not from uniformity, but from negotiation. The American colonies were not born united. They were forged through conflict between empire and frontier, faith and freedom, profit and principle. Their survival was never guaranteed. Disease nearly erased early settlements. Economic collapse threatened stability. External wars and internal divisions tested endurance. Yet over 170 years, from Jamestown in 1607 to constitutional government in 1788, a distinct political culture emerged. It valued written compacts. It mistrusted concentrated authority. It elevated civic participation. It blended Enlightenment philosophy with frontier pragmatism. For a modern American audience, the colonial era is not merely a prelude. It is the crucible in which national identity formed. The debates over taxation, representation, religious liberty, federalism, and individual rights remain central today. The unresolved tensions between equality and inequality, liberty and order, local control and centralized power continue to shape public life. Perhaps the most surprising truth is how improbable the outcome was. At multiple points, failure seemed certain. Jamestown nearly collapsed, Plymouth might have starved, the Revolution might have ended at Brooklyn Heights, the Constitution might have fractured along sectional lines. History often feels inevitable in retrospect, but the colony's path was anything but predetermined. They were experiments, bold, flawed, resilient experiments.
And from those experiments emerged a republic that would grow, fracture, expand, reform, and redefine itself across centuries. The American colonial story is therefore not only about settlement or rebellion, it is about transformation, how scattered outposts became a unified political entity, how subjects became citizens, how local grievances became universal declarations, how fragile beginnings produced enduring institutions. From marshland forts and wooden meeting houses rose ideas powerful enough to alter the course of global history. And it all began with colonies, uncertain, divided, and astonishingly determined.